The Roots of Courage. The sun struggled to rise over the fields of Dorchester County, Maryland, its pale light smothered by a dense morning mist. In a worn cabin tucked between towering oaks, a child was born into bondage. They named her Araminta Ross, but in time, she would be called Harriet, a name that would echo through the corridors of history. From her earliest memory, the world was a place of chains and commands. The crack of the overseer's whip was as common as the sighing wind. At 5 years old, Harriet was hired out to nearby farms, tasked with watching infants and setting traps for muskrats. Her small hands trembled in the cold, but no weakness was tolerated. Punishment was swift and merciless. Her mother, Rit, a strong and deeply religious woman, whispered stories of deliverance into Harriet's ears during stolen moments at night. They spoke of a land far beyond the endless cotton fields, where men and women could walk with unshackled feet. Though the tales seemed like distant songs carried on the breeze, Harriet clung to them fiercely. Hope, she learned early, was an act of rebellion. One afternoon, while fetching goods at the local store, Harriet found herself in the wrong place at the wrong time. An overseer, angered by another slave's attempt to flee, demanded Harriet assist in restraining the man. When she refused, the overseer hurled a heavy iron weight toward the escapee, missing him and striking Harriet instead. She crumpled to the floor, blood pooling around her. The injury fractured her skull and left her with sudden, uncontrollable visions, some said, sent by God himself. After the injury, Harriet was considered less valuable, often left to work alone in the fields. In the stillness of those endless rows of corn, her mind traveled beyond the horizon. She began to dream with her eyes wide open, dreams of crossing rivers under starry skies, of silent marches through shadowed forests, of reaching hands and unbroken songs. But every day, reality pressed harder. Families were torn apart like paper. Siblings were sold south without warning. The whip carved lessons into flesh no words could erase. Harriet watched, helpless, as her sisters disappeared, leaving behind the hollow spaces they once filled. Each departure lit a fire in her chest, burning hotter with each loss. There was no safety here, no mercy. And yet, within Harriet grew a defiance larger than fear itself. She did not know when or how, but she swore an oath in the silent cathedral of the fields. She would break free. And if she found freedom, she would not keep it to herself. As dusk fell over the plantation, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and broken dreams, Harriet lifted her eyes to the stars. Somewhere beyond that velvet sky, something better awaited. She would find it, or she would die trying. The first flight to freedom. The night Harriet chose to run, the world held its breath. The fields, once roaring with life and labor, now slept under a quilt of heavy mist. Only the hoot of an owl and the distant croak of frogs stirred the silence. She wore coarse linen clothes and carried nothing but a scrap of cornbread hidden in her pocket. Fear gripped her chest like a vice, yet her legs moved with determined urgency. Every step away from the plantation was a betrayal punishable by death, and still she walked. Guided by whispers passed from slave to slave, Harriet knew to follow the North Star. It blinked weakly through the clouds, a small, stubborn light. She pressed onward, her heart pounding louder than her footsteps. The woods swallowed her whole. Brambles tore at her skin, and unseen creatures rustled in the darkness. Still, Harriet dared not stop. She knew the patrols would be hunting before the moon reached its peak. Dogs would scent her. Guns would chase her. Yet every thorn that tore her dress, every branch that whipped her face, seemed a small price to pay for the chance to breathe free air. Hours blurred into aching days. Harriet found refuge in shadows, hiding in hollowed-out tree trunks, praying no one would hear her trembling breaths. Hunger gnawed at her insides. Fatigue dragged at her feet. Still, she moved when she could and waited when she must. Strangers became her salvation. A weathered farmer's wife pressed a piece of bacon into her hand without a word. A Quaker couple opened the false bottom of their wagon, ushering her inside as slave catchers passed by. Every act of kindness stitched new strength into Harriet's bones. They, too, believed in a world where no chain could claim a soul. At the edge of a roaring river, Harriet hesitated. The current looked savage, merciless. She could turn back. No one would blame her. But then she remembered the faces of her family, their eyes hollowed by despair. She stepped into the freezing water, feeling it pull at her ankles, then her knees, then her waist. With a grunt, she fought forward, the current dragging at her, threatening to pull her under. Gasping and clawing at the far bank, she heaved herself onto solid ground, soaked but alive. Her body shivered violently, but inside her, a quiet flame blazed brighter than ever. When she crossed into Pennsylvania, Harriet knelt on the ground, her hands trembling against the earth. She looked back only once. Behind her lay a world of sorrow, ahead stretched a future unknown but filled with possibility. Freedom tasted raw, fierce, and real. Yet the victory felt hollow. Her family, her friends, they were still in chains. Harriet stood slowly, the resolve tightening in her chest. Freedom was a gift too heavy to carry alone. A new vow formed on her lips: she would return. Moses of her people. Freedom had gifted Harriet Tubman a life, but it had not granted her peace. Each night, as she lay under the stars or within the rough walls of safe houses, she saw the faces of those left behind: her mother's worn hands, her father's tired eyes, her siblings' silent prayers. The taste of freedom turned bitter in her mouth. She knew she had no choice but to return. The decision was a declaration of war against a brutal system. Slave catchers roamed the streets, eager for a reward. New laws had been passed. The Fugitive Slave Act declared that even in the North, no place was truly safe. Anyone could drag her back into bondage. Yet Harriet felt no fear strong enough to outweigh her purpose. Disguised in ragged clothes, sometimes posing as a field hand or an aging man, Harriet moved like a ghost through towns and forests. Word traveled quietly through trusted hands: Moses is coming. Families waited in secret, clinging to the slim hope that the stories of a savior in the night were true. She became a master of silence and signals. A lantern in a window, a quilt hung in a peculiar pattern, these became her maps. Along the clandestine paths of the Underground Railroad, she led the weary and the terrified, always under the shroud of darkness. Every rescue was a heartbeat away from disaster. Dogs barked in the distance. Men with rifles prowled the woods. Yet Harriet pressed on, refusing to turn back, dragging the weak forward when they faltered. Once, a man in her group, overcome with fear, insisted he would return to the plantation. Harriet's eyes burned with unflinching resolve as she raised her pistol. "You'll be free or you'll die," she said, her voice low but unshakable. He continued the journey, and so did the others, understanding that there could be no retreat. Each mission hardened her spirit. Her visions, sudden vivid flashes that struck without warning, guided her steps, steering her away from patrols and danger. She believed these dreams were divine signs, a direct line between her suffering heart and a listening God. Harriet returned again and again, risking her life each time. She led her brothers to freedom. She carried children in her arms across frozen rivers. She comforted mothers too afraid to speak above a whisper. With every successful rescue, her legend grew. Yet Harriet remained unseen, unnamed, her identity shielded by whispers and code. The South placed a bounty on her head, offering vast sums for her capture, dead or alive. Yet none could catch the woman they called Moses. She moved too swiftly, thought too cleverly, trusted her faith more than any map or guide. With each life she saved, Harriet struck a blow against a monstrous system. But she knew her work was far from over. A greater war was looming, one that would demand even more courage, even greater sacrifice. And Harriet Tubman, the girl once beaten and broken, stood ready to fight. Legacy beyond chains. The country tore itself apart, brother against brother, in the bloody conflict of the Civil War. And once again, Harriet Tubman answered the call of duty, not with hesitation but with fierce, deliberate steps. No longer simply a guide to freedom, she became a soldier without a uniform, a spy without a flag. Recruited by the Union Army, Harriet slipped behind enemy lines, gathering intelligence that could mean the difference between victory and massacre. Soldiers twice her size and half her courage marveled at her fearlessness. Where others saw impossibility, Harriet saw a righteous path, forged through the shadows of danger. In 1863, she led a daring raid along the Combahee River in South Carolina. Through swamps thick with snakes and enemy patrols, she orchestrated the liberation of over 700 enslaved men, women, and children. That night, the river sang with cries of freedom, a symphony Harriet had spent her entire life dreaming of. She stood at its heart, a beacon amid the darkness. Yet, When the war's cannons fell silent, gratitude from the nation was sparse. Harriet returned to a life of poverty, her sacrifices largely forgotten by the very country she had fought to save. She worked odd jobs, sold pies and root beer, and struggled to keep her modest home. Still, her spirit remained unbroken. Harriet turned her focus toward the living legacy of freedom. She opened a home for the elderly and impoverished black people, offering comfort where society had abandoned them. Though she had little, she gave generously, her heart a wellspring that never ran dry. In her twilight years, Harriet sat by the fireside, her hands weathered and her voice softened by time. Children would gather at her feet, wide-eyed, as she recounted tales of secret journeys under moonlit skies, of faith stronger than fear, of a future shaped by those bold enough to dream it. The world shifted slowly around her. She lived long enough to see slavery abolished, long enough to glimpse the seeds of change planted in blood-soaked soil. But Harriet knew the fight was not finished. True freedom, the kind that lived in a person's mind and soul, demanded vigilance and sacrifice beyond a battlefield. When Harriet Tubman closed her eyes for the last time in 1913, the North Star still shone overhead, steady and bright. It had guided her footsteps through swamps and storms, across rivers and into history itself. Now, it watched over her eternal rest. Her story did not end with her death. It rippled outward, inspiring generations to rise, to fight, to believe. A life once measured in lashes and chains was now measured in legacies and dreams. Harriet Tubman, the girl born in bondage, the woman who defied an empire, had become something death could not silence, a living promise that no soul, once touched by hope, could ever truly be chained again.